Your Honor, I'll defend her." The words left my mouth before my father could finish his sneer. For one suspended second, the courtroom went still, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. My father's smile froze halfway between mockery and disbelief. His attorney turned to look at me, brows knit. Even the bailiff paused, hand hovering near the rail. That was the moment everyone would remember later, but it wasn't where the story began. It began 15 minutes earlier in the parking lot behind the county courthouse, where my mother sat in the passenger seat gripping her purse like it might float away if she loosened her fingers. The building was a square of tan brick, the kind every small city seems to have, with a flag that snapped in the wind, and a row of benches that had seen decades of cigarette breaks and whispered arguments. The morning was cold enough to sting, but not cold enough for snow, just that gray, honest weather that makes everything look exactly as it is. "You ready?" I asked. She nodded, though her eyes were already wet, as I'll ever be. We walked through the metal detectors together. Shoes off, belt in the bin. A deputy with tired eyes waved us through. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Somewhere down the corridor, a copy machine clacked like a nervous heartbeat. My mother walked a half step behind me, the way she always had when we were in unfamiliar places. She wore her good navy coat, the one she bought after the divorce, because she wanted something that didn't carry memories. I could feel her watching me, as if checking that I was still solid, still real. Courtroom 3B sat at the end of the hall. The doors were already open. I saw him first. My father was seated at the defense table, leaning back with one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, as relaxed as if he were waiting for a haircut instead of a hearing. His suit was tailored dark gray, expensive. Beside him sat the woman he left my mother for, too young for that kind of confidence, dressed in cream-colored wool, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. On my father's other side was his attorney, a man with silver hair and a briefcase that probably cost more than my first year of college tuition. My father looked up when we entered. His eyes flicked over my mother, then landed on me. The corner of his mouth curled. He leaned toward his girlfriend and murmured something I wasn't meant to hear, but I did. "That stinking country girl thinks she can sue." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words slid under the skin and stayed there. My mother stiffened beside me. I felt her breath catch the way it used to when he criticized the house or the dinner or her hair. For a heartbeat, I considered turning around and walking back out with her. That would have been easier. But we didn't come here for easy. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table. The wooden chair was hard beneath me, polished smooth by decades of nervous shifting. I set my briefcase down carefully, the same one I'd carried through 100 smaller courtrooms before this one. Across the aisle, my father glanced at it and smirked, clearly amused by the idea that I might be playing dress-up. He didn't know. The judge entered. We rose. The bailiff called the room to order. When we sat again, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. As the clerk read the case number, my mind drifted not far but back enough to remind me why we were here. My parents were married for 32 years. They met young, built a life the slow way. My mother worked part-time while raising me, kept the books when my father started his business, trusted him because that's what wives did then. When the affair came to light, it wasn't dramatic. No lipstick on collars, no midnight calls. Just a quiet shift, a series of late nights, a woman who started appearing at business dinners. The divorce came fast after that, too fast. My father hired an aggressive firm. My mother hired no one at first. She was tired. She wanted peace. She signed papers she didn't fully understand because she believed him when he said, "This is fair." It wasn't. We learned that later when documents surfaced, accounts not disclosed, property moved just before filings income that somehow never made it onto statements. By then, my mother had moved into a small apartment with second-hand furniture and a view of the parking lot. She didn't complain. She never did. I was already in law school when the truth came out. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, papers spread out like puzzle pieces, realizing exactly what had been taken and how. That was the day I promised her I'd help. Not as a daughter, as a lawyer. Back in the courtroom, the judge cleared his throat. Appearances for the record. My father's attorney stood, introduced himself, confident, polished. He spoke as if the outcome were already decided. Then the judge looked at our table. Counsel for the plaintiff. I stood. My name is I began stating my full name clearly, and I represent the plaintiff. There was a pause. My father's head snapped up. His attorney turned fully in his seat. The girlfriend's smile faltered. The judge peered down at me. You represent... My mother, I said, gesturing gently to the woman seated beside me. A murmur rippled through the gallery. My father let out a short, incredulous laugh. You can't be serious, he said under his breath. I met his eyes, then really met them for the first time in years. He didn't know. He never asked. He never cared to find out what I'd become once I stopped fitting into his idea of success. The judge asked for my bar number. I provided it. He nodded, satisfied. That was when I said it, steady, respectful, meant for the bench, but heard by everyone. Your Honor, I'll defend her. My father's smirk vanished. And that was only the beginning. Before the judge ever called our case, before my father's smirk dissolved into something harder to recognize, there was a long, quiet unraveling that brought us here. You don't lose 32 years of marriage in one dramatic moment. You lose it in small concessions and paperwork signed too quickly in trust, given one last time when it should have been guarded. My parents met in their early 20s, back when a handshake still meant something, and a promise was expected to last. They married young, rented a narrow house near the edge of town, and built their life one practical decision at a time. My mother worked at the public library for years, then went part-time when I was born. She kept the household running, balanced the checkbook, clipped coupons, and made sure dinner was on the table by 6. My father liked to say he was the risk-taker, the one who built things, but it was my mother who made sure those risks didn't sink us. When my father started his small contracting business, my mother helped without question. She answered phones, organized invoices, and learned enough accounting to keep the books straight. There was no salary for her, just the understanding that they were a team. For decades, that was enough. Then gradually it wasn't. The affair didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It crept in under the cover of late meetings and networking dinners. My father became distracted, impatient. My mother noticed the changes long before he admitted anything, but she told herself she was imagining things. She trusted him, she always had. When the truth finally surfaced, it came in a tired confession delivered at the kitchen table, his eyes already somewhere else. He said he was unhappy. He said he deserved more. He said things that sounded rehearsed. The divorce followed quickly, too quickly for my mother to find her footing. My father hired a lawyer within days. A firm from the city, expensive and assertive. My mother, overwhelmed and ashamed, didn't hire one at all at first. She didn't want a fight. She didn't want neighbors talking. She just wanted the pain to stop. That was the opening my father's legal team needed. The settlement documents were thick and written in language my mother didn't fully understand. She asked questions, but they were brushed aside. This is standard, she was told. This is generous, considering. My father stood there nodding, reassuring her that everything was fair. It wasn't. She signed because she was exhausted. She signed because she believed him. She signed because she didn't know what else to do. After the divorce, the changes came fast. The woman from the business dinners moved into the house my mother had decorated and cleaned for decades. Furniture disappeared. Accounts my mother thought she'd helped build were suddenly out of reach. My father sold a piece of property he'd never mentioned before and claimed it had always been separate. My mother moved into a small apartment across town. It wasn't terrible, but it was nothing like the home she'd spent her adult life maintaining. She brought only what fit into a rented truck clothes photo albums, a few dishes she couldn't part with. She left behind the rest, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't have the strength to fight. For a while, she blamed herself. She told me she should have asked more questions, should have been firmer, should have known better. I told her what every daughter wants to say in that moment, that it wasn't her fault, that trust shouldn't be punished. But the truth was, something had gone very wrong. It took nearly 2 years for the cracks to show clearly. A former business associate mentioned an account that had never been disclosed. A tax document arrived by mistake revealing income that hadn't been listed during the divorce. Slowly, painfully, the picture came together. My father hadn't just been unfaithful to my mother, he'd been dishonest with the law. When my mother finally came to me with the papers spread across her dining table, her hands shook. "I don't want to hurt him," she said. I just want what's fair." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about her and about how far my father had fallen. By then, I was deep into my legal education. I'd chosen family law not because it was glamorous, but because I'd seen what happened when people entered it unprepared. I knew the difference between ignorance and guilt, between a mistake and a manipulation. I also knew the statute of limitations hadn't run out. Filing the lawsuit wasn't easy. My mother hesitated at every step. She worried about retaliation, about costs, about being labeled difficult. I explained the process carefully in plain language, the way I'd learned to speak to clients who were scared of courts and contracts. I told her we weren't seeking revenge, we were seeking correction. When the papers were served, my father reacted exactly as I expected, dismissive laughter followed by disbelief. He assumed my mother had found some desperate attorney looking for a payday. He never once considered that I might be involved. That was his mistake. By the time we walked into the courthouse together, my mother had already reclaimed something more important than money. She had reclaimed her voice. She stood straighter. She asked questions. She trusted herself again. The betrayal had taken years to unfold. The reckoning would take far less time. And as I sat beside her in that courtroom listening to my father's whispered insult, I knew one thing with certainty: the truth had been patient. Now it was ready to be heard. There was a long stretch of years when my father and I barely spoke, and when we did, the conversations were shallow enough to float away the moment they ended. He never asked where I was living, how I was managing, or what I was working toward. In his mind, my story had already been written the day I left home with a suitcase that didn't match and a bank account that didn't impress him. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment over a bakery, the kind of place where the floors creak and the walls hold other people's lives. I worked days and nights, first at a grocery store, then as a receptionist, then as a legal assistant, once I realized how close I needed to be to the law if I wanted to understand it. The pay was modest, the hours were long. I learned to live within my means because I had no other choice. Going back to school wasn't a sudden decision. It grew slowly, fed by quiet observations and moments that stayed with me. I watched clients come into the office confused and scared, carrying folders they didn't understand. I watched attorneys talk over them, not out of cruelty but out of habit. I thought of my mother sitting across from my father's lawyer years earlier, nodding politely while her future was decided in words she wasn't fluent in. That was when I knew. Law school didn't come easily. I was older than many of my classmates and poorer than most. I studied at night with coffee gone cold and outlines scribbled in the margins of borrowed textbooks. I learned how to read statutes the way some people read weather reports, looking for patterns, warning signs, and what wasn't being said. I took on debt carefully the way someone who's been burned approaches fire. My father never knew any of this. He never asked. When we did cross paths at holidays, at the occasional family gathering, he offered casual remarks disguised as concern. Still figuring things out, he'd say, "You know, not everyone's cut out for big careers." I nodded, smiled, and let him keep believing what made him comfortable. There's a particular kind of power in being underestimated. It gives you time. I passed the bar on my first attempt. I framed the letter not because it was glamorous, but because it represented years of restraint. I didn't post about it. I didn't announce it. I simply went to work. I chose family law deliberately. Not the dramatic television version, no pounding gavels or grand speeches, but the kind that happens in conference rooms and quiet courtrooms, where outcomes hinge on preparation and patience. I learned how assets could be hidden and how they could be traced. I learned how fear pushes people into unfair agreements, and how the law can correct that if someone is willing to stand up. All the while, my father continued his life as if the past were neatly resolved. He expanded his business. He traveled. He brought his girlfriend, then his partner, to events where my mother once stood. He spoke of his success as if it were entirely his own doing. When the first irregular document surfaced after the divorce, my mother brought it to me with an apology, as though asking for help were a burden. I told her what I tell every client now: asking questions is not an accusation. It's a right. We went through everything together: bank statements, tax filings, property records. Slowly the truth emerged, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in a series of undeniable facts. Accounts that should have been disclosed but weren't. Transfers that happened just before filings. Income that had somehow slipped through the cracks. By then, I was no longer just her daughter. I was her advocate. I explained her options carefully without pressure. I told her what the law allowed and what it didn't. I told her the risks. I told her we could walk away at any point. What mattered most to me was that she chose fully informed for the first time in years. She chose to proceed. Filing the complaint was both ordinary and profound. Ordinary because it was just another stack of papers submitted to the clerk. Profound because it marked the moment my mother stopped absorbing injustice and began responding to it. My father reacted with predictable disdain. He told acquaintances my mother was being manipulated. He joked that she'd finally lost it. He never once imagined I was behind it. Why would he, in his version of the world, I was still that girl with the mismatched suitcase? That assumption carried him all the way to the courtroom. As we prepared for the hearing, I reviewed every document twice. I rehearsed questions not to humiliate but to clarify. My goal was never to punish him, it was to put the truth in front of a judge and let the law do what it was designed to do. On the morning of the hearing, my mother asked me if I was nervous. I told her the truth. A little, I said. But not about the case. What I didn't say was that I was thinking about my father, about how little he knew me, about the years he spent looking past me. This wasn't a confrontation fueled by anger. It was the natural outcome of his indifference. Some people mistake silence for weakness. They assume that because you don't announce your progress, you aren't making any. My father made that mistake for years. By the time he sneered in that courtroom, it was far too late to correct it. The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the docket, his voice steady and practiced. Courtrooms have a rhythm of their own names called dates, set continuances granted. Most days, nothing truly surprising happens. That morning felt no different at first. Appearances for the record, the judge said. My father's attorney rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket as he spoke. He introduced himself with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. His voice carried just enough authority to signal that he expected cooperation, not resistance. When he finished, he sat down and gave my father a brief nod as if to say everything was under control. The judge turned toward our table. Counsel for the plaintiff. I stood. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. It was as if the room needed a moment to catch up with the simple fact of a woman standing where my father assumed no serious opposition existed. I stated my name clearly, then said I represent the plaintiff. The judge looked up, and the plaintiff is... My mother, I said, gesturing to the woman seated beside me. There it was the first ripple. A murmur moved through the gallery. Someone shifted in their seat. Across the aisle, my father leaned forward slightly, his brows knitting together in confusion. The judge studied me for a moment longer. Your counsel of record? Yes, Your Honor. He paused, then asked the question that settled the matter. Bar number. I recited it from memory, my voice calm. He typed it into the computer, nodded once, and looked back up. Very well, he said. Proceed. My father's attorney turned fully toward me now. His expression had shifted, not to alarm exactly, but to recalibration. He was reassessing the board. My father, on the other hand, was staring at me as if he were seeing a stranger where his daughter used to be. His mouth opened, then closed. The girlfriend beside him stopped smiling. I took a breath and addressed the bench. Your Honor, I said I'll defend her. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They were a statement of role, of responsibility, of readiness. My father let out a short laugh, sharp and disbelieving. This is a joke, he muttered loud enough to carry. The judge's gaze snapped to him. Sir, he said evenly, you'll address the court through your counsel. That was the first time all morning my father was told to be quiet. As we moved into preliminary matters, I could feel the room's attention shift. The judge asked clarifying questions. I answered concisely. My father's attorney attempted to object on procedural grounds, suggesting a conflict of interest. I had anticipated that. Your Honor, I replied, the plaintiff has provided informed written consent. I've complied with all ethical requirements. There is no conflict under state law. The judge reviewed the document, nodded again, and overruled the objection. My father slumped back in his chair, his earlier confidence leaking away. The girlfriend leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but he didn't respond. As the hearing progressed, something subtle but important happened. The tone changed. This was no longer a case to be brushed aside or settled quickly. It was a case that demanded attention. I laid out our position carefully, focusing on facts rather than emotion. I referenced timelines, disclosures, and statutory obligations. I spoke slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted every word to land. Across from me, my father's attorney scribbled notes, occasionally glancing at his client with irritation. My father avoided my eyes entirely. The judge listened intently. He asked questions, not hostile ones, but probing, thoughtful ones. Each answer led to another, tightening the focus. By the time we concluded the opening phase, the shape of the issue was clear. This wasn't about bitterness, it was about omission. When the judge called for a brief recess, the room exhaled. Conversations erupted in low murmurs. My mother reached for my hand under the table. Her palm was warm, her grip steady. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Across the aisle, my father stood and paced. His attorney spoke to him in quick, hushed sentences, gesturing toward the files. The girlfriend hovered nearby, her earlier poise replaced by something closer to unease. I realized then that this was likely the first time my father had ever truly felt outmatched, not physically, not financially, but intellectually and ethically. It was unfamiliar ground for him, and it showed. When court resumed, the judge set a schedule for evidentiary hearings. He ordered the production of additional documents and made it clear that incomplete disclosures would not be tolerated. "Counsel," he said to my father's attorney, "your client will comply fully." "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied, his tone noticeably less casual than before. As we gathered our papers, my father finally looked at me again. There was no anger in his eyes now, just disbelief and something else quieter and harder to name. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply met his gaze, then turned back to my mother. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a shift, not the thrill of victory, but the gravity of responsibility. This wasn't about proving myself to my father. It was about standing where my mother once stood alone and making sure she was heard. For years, my father believed the story ended when the divorce papers were signed. That morning, he learned the law has a longer memory than pride. And for the first time, he understood exactly who had been sitting across from him all along. The evidentiary hearing began on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary weekday that disguises important turning points. The courthouse was quieter than it had been before, the gallery half full with people waiting on their own matters, custody schedules, zoning disputes, small claims that felt enormous to those living them. That normalcy mattered. Justice, I've learned, doesn't arrive with fanfare, it arrives with files. I stood at counsel table and organized my exhibits one last time. Bank statements in chronological order, property records flagged with yellow tabs, tax filings cross-referenced with income reports. Every document had a place. Every place had a purpose. My father's attorney opened with a confident tone that suggested compliance without concession. He framed the omissions as oversights, clerical errors, misunderstandings, timing issues. He spoke of intent, or rather the lack of it, as if intent could erase numbers already printed in black ink. When it was my turn, I rose and began where the truth always begins, with the record. "Your Honor, I said we'll demonstrate a pattern of non-disclosure that materially affected the divorce settlement." I kept my voice measured. This wasn't a performance, it was a demonstration. I walked the court through the timeline. An account opened 2 months before the divorce filing. A transfer executed 3 weeks before disclosures were due. A property sold to a shell entity controlled by my father's business partner. None of this was speculation. Each step was documented. The judge leaned forward. He asked questions that went to substance. I answered with citations and page numbers. When opposing counsel objected, the objections were narrow and quickly resolved. The law favors clarity. My mother sat behind me, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at my father. She looked at the bench, listening. For years, she had been told the truth was complicated. Today, it was simple. When my father took the stand, the room changed again. He straightened his tie and addressed the judge with the confidence of someone used to being believed. He spoke of hard work, of risk, of responsibility. He denied intent. He suggested mistakes. Then the document spoke. I asked him to identify his signature. He did. I asked him to confirm dates. He did. I asked him to explain why income from a particular contract appeared in one filing but not another. He hesitated. Silence in a courtroom is different from silence anywhere else. It isn't empty. It's expectant. His attorney attempted to redirect, but the damage was already done. The inconsistencies weren't dramatic. They were mundane and therefore undeniable. Numbers didn't line up. Timelines didn't match. Explanations grew thinner with each question. The girlfriend testified briefly. She claimed ignorance framed herself as separate from the finances, but the records placed funds in accounts that paid for her car, her travel, her living expenses. The judge took notes without comment. By the end of the day, the picture was complete. Not sensational, not cruel, complete. The judge closed his file and removed his glasses. I'll take the matter under advisement, he said. You'll have a ruling in due course. Outside the courtroom, my father avoided me. He spoke quietly to his attorney. His shoulders rounded now, his voice subdued. The girlfriend stood a few steps away, staring at her phone as if it might offer escape. My mother and I walked down the courthouse steps together. The air felt lighter, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the truth had finally been placed where it belonged. That evening, as we sat at her kitchen table, tea cooling between us, she said something I hadn't expected. I didn't realize how much I'd been carrying, she said. Just trying to be reasonable. I nodded. Being reasonable doesn't mean being silent. When the ruling came 2 weeks later, it was precise and firm. The court found material non-disclosure. Assets were ordered restored, penalties assessed. Not everything was undone, time never gives that back, but the balance was corrected. My father read the decision without expression. When he looked up, his eyes met mine briefly. There was no anger there, only recognition. The law had done its work. The courthouse emptied slowly after the ruling, as if everyone needed extra time to absorb what had just happened. There was no applause, no raised voices, no dramatic exit. Justice rarely looks the way people imagine it does. Most of the time, it looks like people gathering their papers and walking back into their lives with a little more weight or a little less. My mother stood beside me on the courthouse steps, the folded copy of the decision tucked carefully into her purse. Her shoulders were straighter than they had been in years, not because she'd won money, but because something fundamental had been returned to her. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't shaking, she was calm. My father came out last. He looked older than I remembered, not because he'd aged overnight, but because certainty had finally left him. His attorney said a few quiet words, then shook his hand and walked away. The girlfriend lingered for a moment, her face tight with frustration, before turning sharply and heading toward the parking lot without a word. For a few seconds, my father stood there alone. Then he approached us. I didn't expect this, he said. His voice wasn't angry, it wasn't defensive. It was flat, like someone stating a fact they hadn't planned to learn. My mother looked at him steadily. She didn't interrupt, she didn't accuse, she simply waited. I thought, he continued, then stopped. Whatever sentence he'd started didn't survive the moment. He cleared his throat. I didn't think you'd do this. I understood what he meant. He didn't think I would do this. He didn't think I was capable of standing across from him and letting the law speak louder than our history. That's the problem, I said quietly. You never thought to ask. He nodded once, no argument, no rebuttal. We didn't talk long. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to defend. He said he would comply with the court's orders. He said it like someone accepting a weather report, not happy, not furious, just resigned. As he walked away, my mother exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath she'd been holding for decades. The changes that followed weren't sudden, but they were real. Within months, assets were restored. Not lavish wealth, just what should have been there all along. My mother moved out of the apartment with the parking lot view and into a modest home closer to town. She bought new furniture, not to replace the old, but to mark a new chapter. She planted flowers in the yard and smiled when they grew. I watched her learn how to enjoy security without apology. My father tried in his own limited way to reach out. He sent short messages, at first neutral, careful. He asked how my mother was doing. He asked how I was managing my practice. There were no grand apologies, no emotional confessions. just small steps from someone who'd never been good at humility. We met once months later for coffee. He looked at me across the table, really looked this time. "You're good at what you do," he said. It wasn't praise, it wasn't regret, it was acknowledgement. And strangely, it was enough. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I told him. "I did it to fix something that was wrong." He nodded again. I see that now. We didn't reconcile in the way movies like to show. There were no hugs, no sudden warmth. But there was a ceasefire. There was respect. And sometimes that's the most honest form reconciliation can take. As for me, I returned to work with a different perspective. I'd always believed in the law, but now I understood its emotional cost more clearly. I became more patient with clients who hesitated, more careful with those who felt ashamed for not knowing what they didn't know. My mother came by my office one afternoon with a box of cookies and a smile that felt lighter than it used to. She thanked my assistant by name. She asked about cases. She looked like someone who belonged in her own life again. That was the real verdict. Justice didn't erase the past. It didn't restore the years my mother spent doubting herself or the trust my father had broken. But it shifted the balance. It told the truth plainly. And it reminded all of us that silence isn't peace, and compliance isn't fairness. Sometimes the quiet aftermath is the most revealing part of any battle. It shows you who people are once the noise fades. And in that quiet, my mother and I finally felt free. Life didn't transform overnight after the case ended. There were no victory parties, no sudden sense that everything painful had been erased. Instead, there was something quieter and far more lasting. My mother settled into her new routine with a kind of steady gratitude that still moves me when I think about it. She learned the rhythms of her new neighborhood, waved to the same mail carrier every morning, and started attending a book club at the local library. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just a life that finally felt like it belonged to her again. Sometimes she would pause mid-conversation and say almost to herself, "I didn't realize how much I'd been holding my breath." Then she'd smile, the kind of smile that comes from relief rather than happiness. Relief runs deeper. We talked often about the case, not obsessively but thoughtfully. She asked questions about things she once avoided: retirement accounts, wills, healthcare directives. Not because she was afraid anymore, but because she understood something crucial. Now knowledge is not arrogance, and asking questions is not disrespect. That perhaps was the greatest change of all. As for my father, our relationship settled into something honest if limited. We spoke occasionally. We acknowledged birthdays. We discussed practical matters. He never apologized outright, not in the way people expect, but he stopped pretending. He no longer dismissed my mother's contributions or minimized my work. That shift mattered. One afternoon nearly a year later, he said something I hadn't expected. "I thought power was about control," he said. "Turns out it's about accountability." I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. Some lessons land only when a person is ready to carry them. Professionally, the case stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was personal. I became more deliberate about how I explained things to clients, especially older women, who reminded me of my mother, women who had managed households, raised families, and trusted others to handle the important paperwork. I learned to slow down, to translate, to make sure they understood not just what they were signing, but why it mattered. If there's one thing this experience reinforced, it's this: injustice doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like convenience. Sometimes it wears a friendly face and speaks in reassuring tones. And sometimes it depends on good people being too tired or too polite to push back. My mother wasn't weak. She was trusting, and trust should never be punished. Looking back, I don't think of that day in court as a moment of revenge. I think of it as a correction, a quiet, lawful recalibration of a balance that had tipped too far. No one was destroyed. No one was shamed for sport. The truth was simply allowed to stand where it belonged. If you're listening to this and it sounds familiar, if you've ever signed something because you were overwhelmed or stayed silent because you didn't want conflict, I hope you take this story as encouragement. Ask questions. Seek counsel. Don't assume the system is only for people with money or confidence. And if you're the one who underestimated someone, if you believed they would never challenge you, I hope you remember this too. People grow in silence more often than they grow in noise. As for me, I'm still practicing law. still learning, still standing beside people who need a steady voice when theirs feels shaky. And my mother. She's living her life with the quiet dignity she always deserved. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories about truth, resilience, and finding your footing later in life, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for reflecting. And thank you for believing that fairness, when patiently pursued, still matters. 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 Still matters.